Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, we're going to be talking about coincidences. But first, I stopped by the Organic Man coffee truck to reload my supplies. Julio showed me his latest bean. It's huge compared to any other coffee beans I've seen. He now roasts his own beans, but hadn't come up with a name for his blends. I suggested calling the regular house blend the Trike blend, and the big bean being called the Short Bus blend, after their traveling coffee shop, which is parked out front. The bus is a bright yellow VW microbus that was cut in half, so it's a lot shorter than anything out there. It looks like a Minion, but without the blue overalls. I was at a party the other night, and I was talking to Lewis. He mentioned a case where a man jumped in his car to drive into town, and he was killed when an airplane crashed right on top of his car. This got me to thinking about all the really weird things that happen that some would call a coincidence, but I think maybe there's something more going on that we just don't see or understand. I hope the sound of the fan isn't being picked up by the microphone. It's 100 and some degrees and need all the cooling I can get, so... Here are some really weird things that have happened. I usually tell my stories in chronological order, but tonight I decided to just run them as I found them. It doesn't really matter since none of these stories are related. The one actor that starred in two of my favorite, if not creepiest movies, is Anthony Hopkins. The guy that played Corky Withers in Magic, and of course Hannibal Lecter. Hopkins was slated to star in a movie called The Girl from Petrovka, based on a book by George Pfeiffer. Hopkins wanted to read the book so he could get into the part. He began looking for a copy of the book the movie was based on, but he couldn't find it anywhere. This was long before the internet, so Hopkins, being from England, visited all the bookshops he could find. However, nobody had a copy of the book. Later on, Hopkins was heading down into the underground, what they call the subway in England, when he saw that somebody had walked off and left their book sitting on a bench. Out of curiosity, Hopkins picked up the book, only to discover it was a copy of The Girl from Petrovka. He had found the book he was searching for in an underground station in London. It's surprising that somebody else hadn't picked it up before he got there. Hopkins went on to begin filming 2 years later. While in Vienna, shooting on location, Hopkins was visited by George Pfeiffer, the guy that wrote the book the movie was based on. As they talked, George said he wished he still had his copy of the book, but he'd lent it to somebody, and that person went and lost it. The book had been filled with annotations to be used while filming. Hopkins pulled the book out of his bag and said, "You mean like this one?" Pfeiffer opened the book and saw all of his notes. Somehow Hopkins had found the book Pfeiffer had loaned out sitting on a bench in a train station under the streets of London, and then he decided he was going to bring the book with him to Vienna for filming at the very last minute. January 6th, 1922, a survey crew was on the Colorado River looking for the best location to begin construction on the soon-to-be Hoover Dam. John G. Tierney and Harold Conley were hired to examine the sides of the river to find the best location for construction. The two men were examining the rock structure along both sides of the river using a small barge. The Mojave Desert is prone to flash flooding. Most folks don't know this, but you are more likely to drown in the desert than to die from thirst. If there's a lot of rain high up in the mountains, the water will cascade down, filling any rivers or dry washes with massive amounts of water. Well, there was a sudden increase of water coming through the area where the two men were working. The barge tipped over, spilling them into the turbulent river, and both men were drowned. The dam project took 13 years to finish. During this time, 112 people died, either from construction accidents or job-related injuries. As the last of the construction was being done, Patrick Tierney was on top of one of the intake towers when he lost his footing and fell. He was the last person to die during the construction of the dam. Patrick Tierney was the son of John Tierney, who had died on the same day 13 years earlier. Patrick died on January 6, 1935. The first to die was the father, and the last was the son. Despite a lot of urban legends, there are no bodies buried inside the concrete of Hoover Dam. All 112 deaths, the bodies were recovered. So, if you ever do visit Hoover Dam, don't go bothering the guide asking about the bodies in the cement. There aren't any. The Wizard of Oz came out in 1939. I actually watched it again just last night. In fact, I watched it 3 times last year. I talk about this on one of my shows. If you play Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon as you watch the movie, the music lines up with each and every scene. This has become so popular you can go to YouTube and watch it without having to sync the movie and the music. If, on the other hand, you're one of those guys that still owns a record player, if you start watching The Wizard of Oz, when the MGM lion starts to roar, he roars 3 times. At the 3rd roar, that is when you put the needle on the record and start the music. There you will have synced up the movie and the music. It's something to see. Now, do it the easy way. Just go to YouTube. Now back to the movie. Frank Morgan played Professor Marvel and the Wizard of Oz. And he was the gatekeeper. And the carriage driver. And he played the guard. I don't know if this was to save money or he just wanted a lot of on-screen time. Victor Fleming wanted Professor Marvel to have a certain seedy look. A kind of a cross between a carnival barker and a used car salesman. One of the property folks was sent to town to find the right-looking coat. Oh, Victor Fleming, by the way, was the director. An entire rack of coats was brought from the local second-hand store. The director and some of the film crew looked over the coats and picked one that looked just right. It turned out that the coat fit Frank without having to be recut. One day during filming, as Frank was standing around between shots, he ran his hands through the pockets and he looked at the lining. Then he flipped the pocket inside out. On the lining of the pocket it said L. Frank Baum, which struck everybody as being odd since the book the movie was based on had been written by L. Frank Baum. Lyman Frank Baum was an American author famous for his children's books, in particular The Wizard of Oz and its sequels. He wrote 14 novels in the Oz series. Baum was born on May 15, 1856, and he died May 6, 1919, at the age of 62. Towards the end of his life, he had been living in Hollywood. The jacket Frank Morgan was wearing in the movie turned out to have actually belonged to Frank Baum. It, along with some other clothing, had been given to the second-hand store after his death. To be sure that this was not just an urban legend, the production crew had the jacket examined by a tailor in New York who had made the coat originally, and the tailor said that yes, indeed, this jacket had belonged to Frank Baum, and then it appeared in the movie being worn by Frank Morgan. So if you watch The Wizard of Oz, Professor Marvel is wearing Frank Baum's old coat. But it was never planned that way, it just happened. Timur was born April 9th, 1336. He was best known as Amir Timur, or Tamerlane, which meant Timur the Lame. He didn't have the use of half of his body, and he walked with a limp. He claimed to be a direct descendant through his father, Tumani Khan, of Genghis Khan. Timur's armies were inclusive, multi-ethnic, and were feared throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe. Scholars estimate that his military campaigns caused the deaths of 17 million people, which amounted to 5% of the world's population at that time. Tamerlane, while reputedly intellectual and scholarly, he was also ruthless and bloodthirsty. He was notorious for creating gigantic pyramids of human skulls outside the towns he had attacked. This was so that everybody would know that he was all-powerful, and you didn't want to go up against him and his army. His strategy was to be so ridiculously over the top that nobody in their right minds would cross him. After the slaughter of a couple of towns, anyone that heard he was coming near would instantly surrender their town and all their worldly possessions. Still, on occasion, he would still kill everybody anyhow. Timur died February 18th, 1405, and like any good megalomaniac of his time, there was a curse placed on his burial site. The top of his coffin was inscribed with the words, "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." It is also said, or the coffin also said, "Whosoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." Strong words for somebody who's dead. I have a cat going completely nuts in the studio somewhere. Joseph Stalin became the ruler of the Soviet Union when Lenin died in 1924. Stalin had some issues. One being he was afraid somebody might try to kill him, so he tended to kill others first, whether they were planning something or not. He hoped that with Germany invading all of Europe, the West would beat each other up so badly that the Soviets could just walk in and take over. He was also concerned about Japan trying to take over the Far East. Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, hoping to keep the Nazis off his turf. Stalin also liked to have things that he really shouldn't. Relics and artwork. At some point, Stalin decided he wanted to have the body of Tamerlane. What with his having such a reputation as a conqueror, Stalin wanted Tamerlane's body in Moscow to show off to his followers. In 1941, Stalin sent the eminent Russian anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov to exhume Timir's body in order to bring it back to the Soviet Union and do scientific studies of it. They were going to create a replica of what he looked like in real life, based on the contours of his skull. When the local people of Samarkand heard about the Russian plan, they were terrified. They tried to warn Gerasimov's team of anthropologists that there was a terrible curse attached to Timur's grave. Well, the anthropologists, of course, dismissed this as a superstitious mumbo-jumbo. They opened the crypt and broke the seal on Timur's coffin on June 19th. 3 days later, June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launched his surprise attack on Russia, Operation Barbarossa, and began the bloodiest invasion that would cost an estimated 30 million Russian lives. The Germans held the Soviets in such low esteem, it was common practice to shoot everybody, whether they were soldiers or not. As the Germans advanced deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union, Gerasimov became worried about what they may have inadvertently unleashed by breaking into Timur's crypt. Gerasimov tried sending messages to Stalin. Finally, in the winter of 1942, he managed to get through, and Stalin himself, being a very superstitious man, arranged a special aircraft to fly Timur's body back to Samarkand, where they decided to give it a reverential reburial. The pilots were given explicit instructions to avoid flying anywhere near Stalingrad so the plane wouldn't come under attack. Stalin was afraid should the plane get shot down, the body of Timur would never make it back to his crypt. November 1942, Timur's body was reburied and the tomb was carefully resealed. Just a few weeks later, the tide of the German invasion suddenly turned when the Russians managed to snatch a victory at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943. Once Timur was back in his resting place, the curse seemed to be lifted and the invader, far more terrible than him, was being driven out of the Soviet Union. I wasn't sure if this would count as being a coincidence or just a curse, but it's kind of odd how the timelines came the way they did. I'll call it a coincidence and a curse. One of the better horror movies I've seen was The Omen. A creepy show that I've seen 3 times. Gregory Peck played Ambassador Thorne, who adopts a young boy while overseas. When it's time to begin filming, executive producer Mace Neufeld took a plane to the United Kingdom for the film shoot. His plane was nearly struck by lightning. Actor Gregory Peck was about to board a plane to England, but was forced to reschedule at the last minute. The plane he missed wound up crashing, killing everybody on board. Later, when Gregory Peck did get a flight to England, this plane was struck by lightning, causing one of the engines to catch on fire. The next day, screenwriter David Seltzer also was flying to England to join the movie crew when his plane was hit by lightning. During the shoot, the crew decided to hire a plane for some aerial filming. The plane they were due to use was chartered by another client at the last minute. Shortly after takeoff, something happened and the plane crashed, killing everybody on board. Unquestionably, the most horrific scene in the movie was what happened several months after the film. John Richardson was in Holland working on Richard Attenborough's war epic, A Bridge Too Far. A really good movie. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it, but then it's an older movie. Everybody who was anybody was in that movie. And I do mean everybody. Oh, back then. Richardson was the special effects expert on The Omen. He was the guy who had masterminded the film's gruesome death scene where David Warner's character Jennings is beheaded by a sheet of glass in the movie. During filming on A Bridge Too Far, Richardson and his assistant Liz Moore were in a freak car accident. Richardson survived, but Moore didn't. During the crash, a sheet of metal sliced through the chassis and decapitated her. Richardson managed to crawl away from the wreck, and when he got to his feet, he saw a sign for a small city in Holland. The city's name was Omen, spelled O-M-M-E-N. The sign said that the city of Omen was 66.6 miles away. During the filming of The Omen, executive producer Neufeld was staying at the Hilton Hotel in London. He left the hotel early one morning, just a few minutes before a bomb went off. The IRA had tried to blow the place up. A few days later, Neufeld and another producer were heading to a restaurant in London. As the cab was halfway to the restaurant, it was blown up by the IRA as well. The cab had gotten stuck in traffic, or the two men would have been inside the building when it went up in pieces. In late 1930s, after a series of successful gangster movies, Warner Brothers was pressured by FDR's Attorney General, Homer Cummings, to make a series of films that glorified law enforcement agents instead of criminals. So Warner Brothers decided to make a series of Secret Service films starring the actor Ronald Reagan. Reagan once called one of the movies, titled Code of the Secret Service, the worst movie I ever made. But the movie actually saved his life. 40 years later, when President Reagan was the target of an assassination attempt, his life was saved thanks to the quick thinking by Secret Service agent Jerry Parr. Parr had been inspired to join the Secret Service after watching Ronald Reagan in the movie Code of the Secret Service. Apparently he didn't think it was such a bad movie. And because he was there, he was able to save President Reagan's life. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in Sarajevo June 28, 1914. He and his wife Sophie were shot and killed by a Serbian named Princip. I've already talked about how I don't think Princip was lucky to get off two shots that both found their targets, as the shooting may have been a setup to create an excuse to start a war. The route of the motorcade was announced in the newspapers. The car carrying Ferdinand and Sophie drove right by the killer, who was standing on the street, but he couldn't get a shot off because he was too far. So then, the motorcade drove right back by the exact same spot later that day, and they went so far as to stop in front of where the killer was standing. Well, Serbia made restitutions to Austria, but then Austria announced it wasn't enough, and they declared war on Serbia, which eventually led to the Great War, or the War to End All Wars, as they like to call it back then. Here in the United States, it was referred to as the European conflict. After 23 million men were wounded and 19 million died, the war finally came to an end on the 11th hour of November 11th, 1918. That would be 11/11/1918. The car Ferdinand had been riding in when he and his wife were shot was placed in a museum where you can still see it today. The really odd thing about this car is its license plate. The license plate is the same one that had been in the car in June 1914. The plate reads Alpha 111118 or 11/11/18. The same date as the armistice that brought World War I to an end. Could Archduke Ferdinand's car have predicted the last day of such a bloody conflict? In 2002, a man in Finland was riding his bike in a town called Ran, or Rahe. Well, Raahe. It's Finnish, so if you're Finnish, you know how it's pronounced, and if you're not, Raahe, which is about 370 miles north of Helsinki, the capital of Finland. As he was crossing the highway, a truck came cruising along, and the driver didn't see the man until it was too late. The bike rider was killed instantly. The police showed up, and they managed to identify the man, and they were en route to his home to notify his family. A second man on a bike was crossing the same highway a mile from where the accident took place when a second truck ran this man over. The police arrived and began the investigation. They found the ID and called in the information, only to be advised this was the identical twin brother of the man killed at just 1 mile south on the same road 1 hour earlier. The first police team hadn't the time to get a hold of the family when the second twin was killed. Not only was this a bizarre coincidence, there have been very few accidents on that highway, and there have been hardly any fatalities, except for these two. I'm going to take a brief pause here, drink some coffee, get my tongue straightened out. Don't go away, we'll be right back after this, and yes, I am drinking organic man coffee. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. Wrong mouse. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. I just realized I think I played with the same commercial twice, or at least a commercial for the same people twice. He's my brother-in-law, so oh well. December 5th, 1664, a ship was passing through the Menai Strait off the coast of Wales when it hit a submerged rock. The ship began taking on water, and it sank. Passengers tried to escape the sinking ship, but due to the frigid water and rough conditions, only one man was able to survive. Hugh Williams was able to swim to shore and pull himself up the craggy cliffs. He was the only one of the 81 passengers to survive. 121 years to the day later, December 5th, 1785, a ship was sailing through the Menai Strait when it hit a submerged rock. The side of the ship was caved in and the sea began to rush in. The 60 passengers all ran to the rail to attempt lowering the lifeboats, but the ship went down too quickly. Only one man was able to swim the freezing cold water to the shore. His name was Hugh Williams. December 5th, 1820, 35 years after the second shipwreck, a trawler was passing through the Menai Strait when it began to take on water. The crew of 25 men began bailing in an attempt to save their boat as well as themselves. Their best efforts came to naught, and the boat went under. 2 men managed to swim to shore. They pulled themselves up onto the rocks and looked at each other. One was named Hugh Williams, and the other man was his nephew, who was also named Hugh Williams. Now in Wales, the last name of Williams is as common as Smith or Jones is here in the U.S. The first name of Hugh is as common as John. But still, 3 shipwrecks with 4 survivors, all with the same name. I read several accounts of these 3 occurrences. In most, the names were the same and the dates were all December 5th. If you dig deep enough, you can find some stories where the names were similar but not quite the same. You can also find a few different dates, but most of the sites I checked had December 5th and Hugh Williams So this is one really weird coincidence. History is filled with stories of people who thought that they were the best person to run everything. What always surprises me is how many folks are willing to let them. Napoleon Bonaparte was actually born in Italy, but he became a French soldier before trying to take over everything. Adolf Hitler was born in Austria before becoming a German soldier and then trying to take over the world. All those folks who think Napoleon was short need to go back and check their math. When he was the emperor of Europe, he switched from feet and inches to the metric system, just to be different. Then, when his biography was first translated, it came up saying he was 5'7". Napoleon was actually 5'9" tall. Adolf Hitler was 5 feet 9 inches tall. Napoleon began to climb the ladder to power during the French Revolution in 1789. He was a French soldier, but he switched sides and joined the revolutionaries when he saw the army was going to lose. Hitler began to rise through the Nazi Party in 1918, when Germany was going through what was close to a revolution following World War I. Hitler had been sent by the German army to keep an eye on the revolutionaries, and he decided to switch sides when he saw that the German army was probably going to lose. It was 129 years from 1789 to 1918. In 1804, Napoleon became Emperor of France, his adopted homeland. 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, even though he was born in Austria. From 1804 to 1933 is 129 years. In 1809, Napoleon defeated the Austrian army, conquering the country and adding it to his kingdom. 1938, Hitler invaded Austria, making it a part of Germany. From 1809 to 1938 is 129 years. In 1811, Napoleon and Alexander of Russia had come to an agreement that they wouldn't fight each other. Then in June 1812, Napoleon decided it was a good idea to invade Russia. 1939, Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact, basically saying they wouldn't attack each other. Then in June of 1941, Hitler invaded Russia. And it was 129 years from 1812 to 1941. Napoleon got bogged down in Russia in the wintertime. His army was ill-equipped, and many froze to death or starved. By 1814, Napoleon's army was forced to retreat in near disarray. The German army got bogged down in Russia. They were still using summer uniforms, and few had proper clothing or equipment for the cold. Many starved to death or froze. The tides of war turned in 1943, and yes, it was 129 years between 1814 and 1943. If you caught the show about the Titanic, you heard about Violet Jessop. I decided to include her story here since when it comes to coincidences, she is way up there. Violet Constance Jessop was born October 2nd, 1887, near Bahia Blanca, Argentina. She became an ocean liner stewardess and a nurse working for the White Star Line. She was on board the RMS Olympic when it was hit by a British warship, the Hawk. The collision was so bad it bent the keel, causing the Olympic to constantly pull to port, or the left. When the sister ship, Titanic, was launched, Violet was assigned to work as a stewardess on the maiden voyage. We all know what happened then. As the passengers were being lined up on the lifeboat deck, none of the women were willing to step out over nothing to get to the lifeboats. Violet Jessop was told to jump into the lifeboat to show the others it could be done. During the Great War, World War I, the RMS Britannic was converted into a hospital ship. Thus the designation HMHS, or Her Majesty's Hospital Ship. RMS had stood for Royal Mail Ship. In 1916, as they were returning to the Mediterranean to pick up more patients, the ship hit a mine and began to sink. Violet jumped into one of the few lifeboats to be lowered. Once in the water, the boat was pulled into the propellers and chopped to pieces. Violet was able to swim to safety, but she did sustain a very nasty wound in her head. In all, Violet was in way too many disasters involving ships and boats. One collision involving a warship, one collision with an iceberg, one collision with a mine, and one involving the propellers of a ship. Makes you wonder, did anybody getting on board one of those ships look over and see Violet standing there and say, I don't want to sail with that woman? Soldiers and sailors are thought of as being tough, battle-hardened folks who eat, sleep, and think about fighting. Most are just people who are trying to do their job and stay alive. Many have a soft spot when it comes to animals. We had a pet mouse, although it wasn't much of a pet. It had snuck on board our tank, and it kept eating our MREs. During World War II, a new form of warfare came into being. Instead of armies fighting each other, the focus was on destroying the people's will to fight. Civilians became targets as well as soldiers. The German Kriegsmarine set out to starve England into surrender. U-boats tried to sink as much cargo as they could. Merchant raiders went about trying to capture what they could. The Bismarck was sent out to disrupt shipping in the Atlantic and to sink as many British warships as it could. But its primary target was not warships, it was cargo ships. Things did not go well for the Bismarck. It was surrounded and sunk on May 27, 1941. Of the crew of 2,100 men, there were only 116 survivors. 115 men and one cat. The cat was seen floating on a piece of wood, and he was fished from the ocean by the men of the British ship Cossack, who then named him Oscar. Oscar served on board the Cossack for the next few months as the ship carried out convoy escort duties on the Mediterranean Sea and North Atlantic Ocean. I just can't imagine a cat at sea, but then some cats actually do like the water. October 24th, 1941, a Cossack was escorting a convoy from Gibraltar to Great Britain when she was severely damaged by a torpedo fired by a German submarine U-563. The initial explosion blew off 1/3 of the forward section of the ship, killing 159 of the crew. 170 crew were transferred to the destroyer HMS Legion, and an attempt was made to tow the badly listing Cossack back to Gibraltar. Worsening weather conditions caused the task to become more difficult. Then it became impossible. The Cossack had to be abandoned. On October 27th, the day after the tow had slipped, a Cossack sank just west of Gibraltar. Oscar survived the second sinking, and he was brought ashore to the establishment in Gibraltar. Once at Gibraltar, Oscar was renamed Unsinkable Sam. After recuperating on land, the Cat was transferred, along with his crew, to the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Oddly enough, the Ark Royal had been involved in the sinking of the Bismarck, as was the Cossack. As the Ark Royal was returning from Malta on November 14, 1941, the aircraft carrier was torpedoed by U-81. Attempts were also made to tow the Ark Royal to Gibraltar, but the inflow of water made the task futile. The ship was taking on water faster than it could be pumped out, and this was making towing way too difficult. The carrier rolled over and sank 30 miles from Gibraltar. The slow rate at which the ship had sank meant that all but one crew could be saved. Sam was found clinging to a floating plank by a motor launch. The rescuers described him as being angry but quite unharmed. He was then transferred to the HMS Lightning, along with some of his crewmates. The others were moved to the HMS Legion, the ship that had tried to save the Cossack. Legion would be sunk in 1942 and Lightning in 1943. The loss of the Ark Royal proved to be the end of Sam's shipboard career. He was transferred to the United Kingdom. He was transferred first to the office of the governor of Gibraltar. Then he was sent back to the United Kingdom, where he sat out the remainder of the war, living in a seaman's home in Belfast called the Home for Sailors. Sam died in 1955. There's a portrait of Sam titled Oscar, the Bismarck's Cat, by artist Georgina Shaw Baker. It is in the possession of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. I wonder if this is a coincidence or it's just one unlucky cat. He may have survived the sinking of 3 warships, or did he have something to do with them going down? After all, 2 of the ships that he was on board had been involved in the sinking of the Bismarck, his first home. 1974, a cab driver was taking a customer to his destination in Bermuda. A 17-year-old boy was putting along on a moped when the cab driver accidentally hit him. The boy was killed instantly, much to the horror of both the driver and the passenger. 1975, the same man arrived in Bermuda, and he called for a cab. When the cab arrived, the passenger jumped in and told the driver where he was heading. As the cab was passing a young man on a moped, the boy swerved and was struck and killed by the cab. The passenger suddenly realized the cab driver was the same one that had killed a boy on a moped just a year before. As the police began their investigation, it turned out the boy just killed was the younger brother of the boy who had been killed a year before, and he had just turned 17. The same cab driver ran over both boys with the same passenger in the back. The 2 accidents were on the same street, just a few blocks apart. During war times, it's important to be able to identify not only the enemy, but your own troops as well. In basic at Fort Knox, we were issued playing cards with pictures of tanks on them. These were just silhouettes all in black. We would spend hours of our off time looking at each card so we could tell who was who. It got to a point we would see who could identify a tank seeing just a small portion of the image, like the top third of the turret. I wore my cards out by the time I got out. Ships at sea all have distinct silhouettes. Even sister ships can be differentiated on some occasions. This led to a unique way of waging war using merchant raiders. My favorite merchant raider was the Atlantis, commanded by Captain Rogue. I've talked about it on several shows, and I mentioned it in my book, Triangle. The Atlantis holds the record for sailing for 23 months without ever putting into port. The hold of the ship was filled with canvas and plywood. The crew would build false structures to make the Atlantis look like many other ships. Lots of paint was used. They even had an extra smokestack that could be mounted on deck. The crew had a book filled with pictures of just about every ship at sea, so they could make themselves look like other ships that had the basic same size. You don't want to try and disguise a 600-foot ship as something that's only 300 feet long. During World War I, the ships would be disguised to look like easy targets, only to turn into warships as the enemy approached. One of these ships was the SMS Cap Trafalgar, a German ocean liner, launched in 1913. She was 613 feet long and 72 feet wide, the largest commercial ship in South American waters at the time. The Trafalgar arrived in South America only a few months before World War I broke out. The ship was fitted with several armaments, like 2 4.1 naval guns and 6 37mm British autocannon, which were now mounted on the German ship. The guns were hidden behind screens that could be dropped when the enemy came into range. The silhouette was changed to make the Trafalgar look like a British ship, the RMS Germania. The name was painted on each side of the bow and along the stern. The Germania was a British ship that had been launched in 1905. It was 650 feet long and 72 feet wide. Even though the Trafalgar was 37 feet shorter, the odds of this being discovered while at sea was pretty slight. Once the disguise was in place, the Trafalgar set out to attack merchant ships flying the British flag. The British Navy was aware the German Navy used merchant raiders. The trouble was, how would you figure out who was an actual merchant ship and who was in disguise? If they stopped every ship they encountered, the Navy would never be able to go looking for German ships, and the trade moving about the oceans would be dramatically hindered. You couldn't stop every ship at sea to try and find out who was who. So the Admiralty came up with a plan. They refitted a merchant ship with deck guns and other armaments to go looking for merchant raiders. The ship they chose to take on this mission was the RMS Germania. Not too bizarre. It was a British passenger ship, and the Admiralty could call into service any ship flying the British flag. Now, with deck guns mounted on the deck and covered by fake superstructure, the HMS Germania went looking for trouble. September 14th, 1914, the HMS Carmania was searching the waters around Brazil coast, where the Germans were known to have secret naval bases. On the horizon, they spotted smoke coming from the port in Trinidad Island. The SMS Cap Trafalgar, now sailing as their Carmania, had just finished refilling their coal bunkers, and they were building up steam in order to go looking for victims. As the real Carmania was approaching the island, the fake Carmania sailed out of port and turned towards the east. The captain of the real Carmania could see the other ship, and he was wondering why there was a British ship in the area and why it looked like the other ship was trying to get away from them. The real Carmania began to follow the fake Carmania as it sailed east. Then, the fake Carmania turned and it began to close on the real Carmania. I'm just going to use the real names to avoid confusing y'all or myself. The Trafalgar was going to try attacking what they thought was an unarmed British ship to either capture it or sink it. As the Trafalgar came within range, the Carmania fired a 56-pound shell that traveled at 2,300 feet per second. The shell missed, exploding near the bow, sending a plume of water high in the air. Well, the Trafalgar fired back, and soon both ships were sending huge shells back and forth. The Trafalgar was at an odd angle and could only use half of their guns. The Carmania had managed to get the advantage, and they were able to use all four of their main guns to hammer the German ship. Soon, the Trafalgar was taking on water, and it was listing to one side. The Trafalgar managed to hit their Carmania amidships, and the cabins below deck caught fire. Smoke was billowing from both ships as they continued firing at each other. The captain and the bridge crew were forced to abandon the bridge of the Trafalgar, but the gun crews continued to fire. As the Trafalgar began to sink, the crew were forced to abandon ship. The Carmania was burning, and their bridge was barely functioning. Several German cargo ships came to the area, but they tried to stay out of the line of fire. The captain of the Carmania ordered his ship south, hoping to encounter other British ships. It took 2 days before other British ships were encountered, and the Carmania was able to assess the damage. The overall impression was, had the ship not found friendly vessels, it would have sunk shortly thereafter. The odds of the counterfeit ship being attacked and sunk by the ship it was pretending to be, considering how big the oceans are and how many ships were out there, is, well, kind of mind-boggling. Gamblers tend to be very superstitious. Some of them have lucky underwear and unlucky actions. Things like don't say certain things or don't eat certain things they consider to be unlucky. In 1858, 4 men were playing cards when it looked as if one of them was just a little too lucky. He had won $600 from the other players. That would be like $17,000 today, and they began to suspect that he was cheating. They accused Robert Fallon of cheating, and during the argument, he was shot dead. Now, with the dead man holding the pot, the other gamblers became worried that the money might be tainted. It might have become unlucky. Not wanting to just leave the money on the table, they came up with a plan to win the money back. They invited another man to sit in on the game, and his stake was the $600. After a few hours of play, the new guy had turned the $600 into $2,200, like about $63,000 in today's cash. The police weren't too interested in why Fallon was shot, figuring he was probably guilty of cheating, and this was the Wild West, so they didn't arrest anybody for the shooting. But they did insist that the original $600 was to be given to the next of kin of Robert Fallon, if and when they could find him. With $1,600 in his pocket, the new guy left the gambling place. The next day, the police came to see him, with the intention of handing over the $600. It had been discovered that the new gambler was the estranged son of Robert Fallon. They hadn't seen each other for over 7 years, and the son had no idea that his dad had just been shot before he joined the card game. In the 19th century Austria, a not very famous painter named Joseph Agner attempted suicide on several occasions. Artists tend to be a bit colorful, and they sometimes take things to an extreme. During his first attempt to hang himself, at the age of 18, Agner was interrupted by a Capuchin monk who stopped him from his self-destruction. The monk managed to talk him out of committing suicide. Age 22, Agner once more decided that life just wasn't worth living, and he went to hang himself from a tree. As he was tying the rope to the limb, a monk came along and began talking to the artist. He said it was wrong to take his own life, and soon Agner was talked out of his planned demise. The monk was the same one that had intervened in his first attempt. 8 years later, Agner was arrested for political agitation by the government. He'd been the commander of the Academic Legion during the 1848 revolution in Vienna. Agner was court-martialed for high treason and condemned to death. He was sentenced to be hung in the public square. As the execution was about to take place, a monk arrived and began to plead with the military court to allow this man to live. The general in charge listened to the heartfelt plead and decided to show mercy on Agner. His sentence was dropped. Guess who the monk was? At age 68, Joseph Agner finally succeeded in killing himself. He used a pistol to shoot himself, and he did it while nobody was around to stop him. His funeral ceremony was conducted by the same monk that has saved his life on 3 different occasions. Agner never knew the name of the monk, and nobody ever bothered to write it down, so I can't tell you who he was. James Lewis of Lima, Ohio, was adopted in 1940, just 3 weeks after he had been born. He was named James by his adoptive parents, and he had a dog named Toy. As a schoolboy, he enjoyed math and carpentry, but he didn't like spelling. He went on to marry a woman named Linda. Later, he and Linda were divorced, and he married a woman named Betty. He had a son that he named James Allen Lewis. James worked as a security guard, he drove a Chevy, and he was an avid chain smoker. James Springer of Piqua, Ohio, was adopted in 1940, just 3 weeks after he was born. He was named James by his adoptive parents, and he had a dog that he named Toy. As a schoolboy, he enjoyed math and carpentry, but he didn't like spelling. He went on to marry a woman named Linda. Later, he and Linda were divorced, and he married a woman named Betty. He had a son he named James Allen Springer, but it was Allen with 2 L's instead of 1. James worked as a deputy sheriff. He drove a Chevy, and he was a chain smoker. They were twins. They had been separated at birth. They had grown up 45 miles apart. They ended up leading almost identical lives. Both Jim's mothers knew that their sons had had a twin. Springer's mother was under the impression that the twin had died, while Lewis's mother knew a bit more about what was going on. When she'd gone to a judge to get her adoption paperwork finalized, she had overheard someone mention that the other baby had also been named James. It was this message that was ultimately passed on to Jim Lewis, who then went looking for his twin. At age 39, Jim Lewis called the probate court, which had a record of his adoption, and he was able to contact the Springer family in Piqua. He said, the other James said, "I came home one day, and I had a message to call Jim Springer." He did, and before he could help himself, blurted out, "Are you my brother?" 4 days later, 1979, Jim Lewis met Jim Springer. They discovered they had both suffered from tension headaches. They were both nail biters, and they even discovered that they smoked the same kind of cigarettes, and they vacationed in the same area in Florida. Upon hearing about the Jim twins' uncanny resemblance, researchers at the University of Minnesota invited the pair to come to their facility for testing. The team of researchers had been performing an ongoing study of twins, hoping to discover if separation had any role in what's known as nurture versus nature. Between 1979 and 1999, the team studied 137 pairs of twins, including the Jims, that had been reared apart from each other. The research sparked more than 170 separate studies focusing on medical and psychological characteristics of twins. The bulk of what they discovered centered around the effect environment has on child rearing and the way genetic factors in as a comparison. Well, Jim Lewis recently divorced his Betty and remarried a woman named Sandy. His brother Jim was the best man. There's no word yet on whether Jim Springer knows anybody named Sandy. I don't much like coincidences. They bother me. As if things happen around us that we have no control over. I'm not a control freak, but I hate not having something to do with the direction that my own life takes. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you missed any of the past shows, you can find them at strangethings.podomatic.com, and you can find the show archives on YouTube. For some mysterious reason that I can't quite put my finger on, the show I did 2 weeks ago about the Zodiac Killer has been removed from Podomatic, which means that it's not on iTunes or Stitcher or any of the other podcast places. It is still on YouTube. I'd received an email saying there was some kind of a copyright violation, which I don't quite understand. Some company is claiming that they own the name Zodiac. At least that's all I could figure out from the email. So I'm trying to find out if I have to simply rename the show something other than the Zodiac Killer to get around this weird predicament. Or you can just go to YouTube and listen to it there. Anyway, till next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?